Welcome everybody, SF Live, episode number 38. I'm joined by Akiba Leisman. He's the CEO of Mako Mining. And as always, before we switch over to Akiba, please use hashtag AskMKO. That's the company's ticker for your questions during this live stream. We'll get to those towards our quick chat with Akiba. We're going to talk about a couple things before we get to the Q&A. Also, make sure to follow us on Twitter, YouTube. We're also on Spotify and Instagram. Make sure you follow us there. Give us a thumbs up if you like our content. So, without further ado, I'm going to switch over to Akiba. How are you, Akiba? How are things?
Pretty good.
Yeah, it's good to see you. It's good to see you. You're the first person I know that publicly stated they have corona and obviously survived. So how are things? Let's spend a minute on that, because for me, it's a novelty talking to somebody who actually had corona. So,
sure. I mean, for me personally, it was minor symptom-wise. So I was sick, at least that I could tell, for about 16, maybe 17 days, thereabouts. Prior to the pandemic, I would say all but 4 or 5 of those days, frankly, I would have gone into work because it was really kind of mild. Got tired in the afternoon. I had maybe 4 or 5 days of over 101, call it 38, 39 Celsius fever. And then after about 2 weeks, it got out of my system. The bigger thing is I live and work in Manhattan, right? So we were really one of the major hotspots around the world. It was pretty dramatic what was happening in the city. My wife's a physician. She works at what's now become a COVID hospital. She was there during the peak. It was pretty grueling in terms of seeing what actually went on with patients. But at least things seem to be stabilizing and certainly improving over here in New York. So that's good.
Yeah, just like I saw photos of completely empty streets in downtown Manhattan. It was really, really scary. Like they're filming some post-apocalyptic movie, right? So that's crazy, because I've been to New York. It's a packed place. It's full of people. It's always busy, right? The city that never sleeps. So,
in front of her hospital, there was a field hospital in front of Mount Sinai where she works, and so you had tents. It was filled to the brim with about 50 patients over there. So that's been taken down. So about 3 weeks ago, they discharged the last patient that was staying in Central Park proper, and now you just have a bunch of spoiled grass on the ground. So things clearly are improving.
Any loss of smell or anything before we get on to more important issues here?
That's been a fairly consistent symptom, but I never actually lost sense of smell. The big thing was it was clear that at a certain point in the day there was a profound level of fatigue that I was experiencing, which really caused me to believe, when I was having very mildly symptomatic, to have it, and then it got bad after about 7 or 8 days. And again, bad I'm using on a relative basis. I've had flu certainly a lot worse than what I experienced. And then it's not unique to have people go through a 2-week regimen, mild symptoms, with day, call it 7 to 10 being kind of the worst of the bunch.
No, I'm glad to hear you okay, and you went through it, and I think your whole family had it too, right? So,
yeah.
Oh, that's crazy. No, but. Yeah. Okay. Can't change it now, but it's quite interesting to hear feedback from somebody who actually had it, right? Instead of just reading the news, because I've started have massive trust issues, right? Like just out of fun, like I sometimes open Fox News and CNN right next to each other just to see what the headlines look like. So it's pretty interesting out there. So let's get back to Mako. We're done with Corona now. That was the original idea behind SF Live anyway. But let's talk about more interesting matters. And you've done a lot of webinars lately, right? So preparing for our conversation here, I've watched a couple, and there are definitely some really good full length webinars where you flip through the presentations. And I'm sure I'll make sure to link to a couple. I think Adelaide Capital, Deb, has done a couple with you, Q&A sessions as well. So it's been a bit difficult finding a certain angle to chat with you about, right? One thing I want to talk about obviously is Nicaragua. The situation down there is developing, and I want to see where you're at with production and whether you're expecting any delays. Maybe you can give us an update on Nicaragua and the production first.
Sure. I think in general around the world, data about what's going on within the country, whether countries are honest and earnest about the numbers, or whether there are some political reasons to change the accounting, it's difficult to get a good solid sense on what is actually going on the ground over there. By all accounts, from the virus perspective, things have gotten substantially worse in Managua, probably about 4 weeks ago, thereabouts. We're hearing anecdotal pieces of information that some of our contractors are starting to contract it here and there, which is a kind of an interesting anecdote in terms of community spread within the country. Commercial flights have been basically stopped in Nicaragua. It's actually been very difficult to get our supervisory expats in and out of the country. At one point, we were running rotations on about 11 expats that were managing just over 400 local employees, predominantly local employees over there. When the peak of the virus panic happened in March, we pulled everybody out of the country. And I've actually only been able to get 2 of those back into the country to help supervise some of the work that we're doing. So luckily, we have some great local contractors who effectively have been deputized to run our operations. We put out a press release, I guess 5 weeks ago, thereabouts, that took our first gold pour date back from late summer of this year to sometime in Q4. So even at the time where we actually had very little granular levels of information on what the delays were, it was clear that there was going to be delays to the project. And yeah, that's kind of what we're experiencing, not just on the grounds, but also with some of our suppliers really around the world. We have things coming from South Africa. We have things coming from hard-hit Europe. We have things coming from North America to supply our operations. So I don't think there's any doubt that there was going to be at least a few-month delay from the project from what we were initially anticipating very early in this year.
Yeah, I understand. Like Colombia, for example, also a South American, Latin American country, has banned all international travel till the end of August, right? And it's just the end of May right now. So that's another 3 months of no travel, like getting anybody in another country, right? So how are you accounting for that? Like one thing I want to hint at is like balance sheet was always, let's call it weaker. You've always been running a working capital deficit. It's like the one thing when we met in January here in Vancouver, I think you were my first meeting of 2020. It was like you were running a cash position of $1 million at the time. I'm sure how that's changed. You entered a loan, but maybe you can address that as well, because you've been running the production or the construction on a shoestring budget as well. So maybe we can address that issue.
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand the shareholder base of Mako first and foremost. We do have a controlling shareholder with just under 56% of the outstanding stock being owned by Wexford. I think it's fair to say that the way that Wexford manages portfolio companies is definitely on the aggressive side of balance sheet management. And by that, I mean there's very few of our portfolio companies that run with excess cash. And that's done for a few reasons. One, just in terms of balance sheet optimization itself, but more importantly, and we've experienced this before with some of the projects that we work on, if you believe that you are poor, you act more efficiently than if you believe you are rich. And one of the problems that we've always had is that when you have a multi-billion-dollar private equity and hedge fund group backing you, it really does get to the point where you're expecting manna from heaven raining down on you. And we do make it a point that anytime we do financings that are principally going to be put in by Wexford, certainly the debt facility that we announced in early February as well, it really is there to be the absolute minimum requirement that the company needs, because we do believe that people act more efficiently on that basis. So there's been two financings that really spearheaded the project development. One was a rights offering that was backstopped by Wexford, an equity rights offering that closed in July of last year. So we invited all shareholders to participate. Prior to that, Wexford was a low 40% holder of the equity, and then they took 72% of the rights offering, which is how they accreted to the 56% position that they are right now. We were adamant at the time that was not going to be a sufficient amount of capital to build a mine. It was there to serve as the majority of the capital needed to build a project. And then we announced, and we were fairly open about the needs for capital, and then we announced an unsecured credit facility in early February to the tune of $15 million that we characterized at the time as a breath-holding and belt-tightening amount that the company needed to get to first gold pour at the end of the summer of this calendar year. All 15 million has been drawn down. The last 5 million tranche was drawn down a week and a half ago. None of that has been taken down to Nicaragua, so we have just over $5 million of cash on the balance sheet today, offset with $15 million of debt. Because of the delays, I think there's a reasonable expectation that there's going to be a small quote unquote overrun in terms of where we were in early February before the real effects of the virus became apparent. And one of the good things about having a shareholder like Wexford is that the project is going to get finished in a way that's going to be positive to shareholders. There's going to be a moment in time, though, where Mako does graduate and becomes what I would consider to be more of a real public company, in which case we're going to have to manage our balance sheet more conservatively than we have in the past. And I think that's certainly a fair criticism of the company, but it's definitely one that has been by design rather than by happenstance.
Okay. There's one thing that sort of like always sticks out is building a mine on a shoestring budget. As you said, there's Wexford is backstopping most of it, so that's fine. Their money is available if really, really needed, but you don't want people thinking that money is just going to fall from the skies when necessary. So my question more is like, when you build something on a shoestring budget, are you cutting corners? Like I've seen a couple operations, or sometimes you hear stories like, oh, we're just reopening this mine, they ran it the wrong way. I think West Dome's Eagle River is a good example for it, where they ran something on a shoestring budget and they didn't spend enough in the infrastructure. Like I saw the computer system they were running, that it was running on big floppy disks from the 80s, right? So that's just an example of like not spending enough at the time. Where are you cutting corners? Where are you cutting costs? Like how are you managing that mentality that it is okay to spend, but spend it properly? Like, do you know what I mean? Like what I'm trying to get at?
Correct. So, I mean, let's define what cutting corners actually means. There's a few principal things that need to happen from an understanding the geology side. So we're actually comfortable in a couple of fronts. One, to actually have the go-ahead of the project itself. And Mako was created at the tail end of 2018. I actually took over as interim CEO a few months after that. But even in previous management, I think everybody acknowledged that the PEA, and especially the bones of the original resource estimate, it was crazy to think that you would be able to go into mining production on the back of that resource estimate. There was actually quite a bit of engineering that went into the CapEx and the plant design over there. The actual resource was put together partially because of lack of data, and partially because I do think people were trying to make this project seem something that it was not. The very first thing that we did was redo the geological model based on the drilling that we had at the time. So this was about April of last year. And that incorporated the original resource estimate was put out in 2015. So there was a drill program, metallurgical and infill, that was done in 2016, and a subsequent one in 2018 before I took over. And we used that data and incorporated it into an updated geological model. And we made a decision at that time that there was a lot of gaps in that resource model, but we kind of knew what the data would show. It would show that this was going to be an economic deposit that justified the spend of what was US $28 million to get this up and running over there. Now, having said that, there was actually a substantive need for an infill program to kind of not only confirm but optimize the real mine plan, and we budgeted and have subsequently increased the infill program to roughly 25,000 meters just on San Albino itself, the primary project. So we're not cutting corners in terms of what we actually need to develop a real mine plan around. So later this week, there will be a press release that the infill program is finished. We're going to get data back over time, and there will be an updated resource estimate that will happen in Q3 of this calendar year. But based on an internal threshold, we were able to go over that. And now from a public market disclosure perspective, we're going to do everything that a normal mining company would do to get investors comfortable. Now, in that scenario, the cutting corners is not on real access to data. The cutting corners is strictly from a temporal perspective. Is that normally a mining company would go through this, They would use that as the data to go and raise capital and then build the mine 2-3 years later. I think it's fair to say that we've taken an accelerated approach just to get this thing up and running for a whole host of reasons. Socially at the local level over at the mine, but also from an investment perspective, is that if you have a project that's going to be delivered 3 years later, you better have that incremental return for that amount of time to justify. And as investors, very often we don't tolerate those kinds of delays.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense because you skipped a couple studies, right? So you skipped the PFS, you skipped the FS, and you went off into the mine build, at least publicly, off the PEA from 2015, right?
Yep.
Super numbers, like super low, like below $400 all in sustaining costs, and so look super sexy. But let's just look ahead 12 months and something. Let's say it doesn't work out. Worst case, right? Something's wrong, like metallurgy, something. All of a sudden, there's clay on the heap, and it just doesn't agglomerate or something. I don't know. This stuff happens, right? That level of confidence, you always hear like, oh well, they built it off a PEA, right? So how do you mitigate that part?
Well, it's really kind of allocating like the key risks. So I think it was a lot of risk on how that resource was put together. I mean, the way that the 2015 estimate, kind of at a high level perspective, is that they modeled it as a much less structurally controlled deposit than what it really is. So these are roughly speaking, in the 2015 estimate, they were larger, kind of more continuous structures. Continuous is kind of a loaded word, but continuous structures that showed higher tonnage and relatively lower grade than what reality really was. We knew that when the updated modeling was done with real geochemical and geology controls that were put on the model itself, albeit it was a model that needed to be infilled to confirm that. And then the first thing that we did after that was we launched an expanded, but eventually a 25,000 meter infill program to get this down to anywhere from 10 to 20 meter spacings on the resource model itself. So key risk was isolated, and we mitigated it before the real capital spend happened. You mentioned metallurgy. There were some things that came out of that PEA that showed key risks associated with metallurgy. Our host rock is in a graphitic schist. You go down to site, you touch the core, and it looks like you got mud on your fingers, especially when the core is wet. And metallurgists freak out when they see that. It's like, oh my God, you got carbon there. You can't actually process this because you're all going to have these preg robbing issues. And there were actually certain samples within the PEA that showed pretty piss poor recoveries on certain of the resource estimate. Now, a few things that happened there. When in 2016, at our request, based on the history of this company, so it was the predecessor of Mako, we demanded an updated metallurgical program that was done in 2016, the data of which was never actually publicly released until December of last year. So there was about a 2-year delay before the company actually put out into the public domain what this is. And what we showed is that most of the carbon in the system is inorganic. It's not preg robbing at all. There is a portion of it that is organic, anywhere from 0.2 to 0.7% of the material that you need to watch out for. But it's one of the reasons why we selected kind of early on in this process a CIL plant. And if you operate a CIL effectively, you can control some of the preg robbing issues associated with graphite. And then you have certain things where I think it's fair to say that we're taking a bet, right? So everybody talks about risk is actually also a loaded word, right? So we are investors. To mention the word risk without taking into account price and time is not understanding what risk means. If you are approaching the management of a company and using the term risk as simply getting more information, you are operating not as an investor, but as an employee. So an employee of a company, you have a mentality and a mode to not screw things up. So you're always going to try to get that next piece of data and move ahead over there, delay the project, potentially put in a lot more capital to get things up and running. For us, we're always going to be managing our risk based on isolating what the key risks, trying to mitigate it as much as possible. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a judgment call, not based just on the information that we have on the ground, but also based on price and time on whether or not it's an appropriate call to make. And certainly there are some things within our project that a normal mining company would want to spend years to figure out. Our approach is to take an initial mine plan of 500 tons a day, learn a lot from that, and then apply that for other deposits elsewhere on our property to eventually expand this to what a more normal run rate will be. To take the incremental approach on developing these things, mitigating the key risks as best we can, but still operating under the assumption that we are investors over here and our main objective is to make the stock work.
Sure. No, that makes sense. And one thing, since we're talking about risks here, is social and political risk in Nicaragua as well. That has people's hairs often standing up at the back of their neck. And like with the whole Corona crisis and the whole situation worsening in Nicaragua right now, what are you doing to alleviate that off? Maybe keep that off Mako's back a little bit. And I'm not saying getting rid of it, but I mean, like, how do you mitigate? Like, how do you communicate with local communities? Like, how do you support them in this time of crisis? I don't know. Like, one example would be delivering food or something to the communities, right? And how are you mitigating, let's call it that, political social risk?
Sure. So I guess first off is that we're fortunate that we are part of the community. This is not a man camp operation, except for some expats and executives that would come into an executive suite for supervisory work. Everybody lives in Nueva Segovia and commutes into work. Most of our employees are from the surrounding communities, mainly El Jicaro, a town of a few thousand people. We employ right now, I would guess, somewhere between 25 and 30% and between us and our contractors, between 25 and 30% of the adult male population of the community itself. So it really is an important thing. Everybody is really excited to get the project up and running. I think everybody in the community understands that in project development mode, the main approach over here is for employment. We do things on the margin to help out, and then once the mine is in cash flow, I think more capital intensive projects for the community will be invested in. So we have excellent relations from a local perspective. From the federal level, they've been very, very supportive of getting the mine up and running. There are historical, certainly economic reasons. I mean, even though we're going to start off at a relatively small run rate, Nicaragua is a tiny country. So, I mean, even our small mine is going to be economically impactful. Back of the envelope calculations, I think we're going to account for somewhere between 1 and 1.5% of GDP when we're at our full run rate over here. So even though we're small, it is going to be a fairly substantive endeavor. They've been very supportive of getting the project up and running. I do think that there are political risks in Nicaragua. There was social unrest in 2018 that was frankly put down on an over-aggressive basis by the federal government. I think everybody learned a lot of lessons from that. There will be elections next calendar year. By all accounts, I think the ruling party will likely win that too. I think there are reasonable risks to take on who's going to succeed Daniel Ortega, who's been in power for over a decade now. So that adds to political uncertainty. The way that I like to describe political risk in Nicaragua is that the biggest risk of Nicaragua is just that the country is small. It doesn't really take a very large butterfly to flap its wings to change the political winds, if you will, whereas it does take a pretty large size Mothra-esque butterfly to move things in the United States. So things can change on a dime. Now, how you mitigate this in the long run, I think there are valid reasons why single asset producers aren't the optimized structure of a public company. So I think once the mine is up and running, we have no objections to do smart M&A in either direction, buying, selling, merging. I think there is merit to doing that in different jurisdictions as well. But that's something for later in our life cycle. Yeah. And then with respect to the virus, as I mentioned before, things are getting incrementally worse in Nicaragua. We haven't had too many indications of infections in and around our mine in Nueva Segovia, but it's an airborne virus, and eventually it's going to get to everybody.
No, let's monitor that. I'm really curious, like, what the next steps are for the company now as well. It sounds like you're going to do a COVID financing, let's call it COVID financing, because of the delays, you'll have a financing gap. It's something you need to bridge. Not sure what you can say about that, like how much you might have to raise, maybe $5 million. I don't know, that's my personal guess, right? But at 43 cents, I think the risk, or the dilution risk, is quite minimal. I think you're doing quite well. We're running out of time as well, so just maybe you can sum it up for us, like in a couple sentences, like next steps, what's coming out for Mako. And no, wait, before we sum it up, I really want to talk about your Twitter activity real quick.
Right,
okay.
Sure.
I love your peanut hair trimmer. It looks like it's doing a fantastic job on you. One thing I really like, and I hope more companies do it as well, is just get more visual. Like you post a lot of photo updates on your production, so that's really helpful for investors to see. And the following question is, like, you've been quite active. You slowed down a little bit, and I'm wondering, like, the statements you're making. You announced that you're putting out a press release this week on Twitter. Like, how selective has IROC reached out to you? Has the ACC reached out to you? Like, I'm just curious. Like, you're your CEO that's quite vocal out there, so I'm just wondering. Like, should people follow in your footsteps or stay far away because you've been slapped in the wrist too many times? So,
Right. We've been in addition to being a public executive of a mining company, I also used to have a day job of running a mining portfolio within a large SEC regulated hedge fund, Wexford Capital. So we're fairly well versed into what levels of materiality actually mean. So one of the things that I do on Twitter is that I'm actually very careful with what I say. Like a lot of it is tinged with some humor, sometimes off-color humor. But if you actually parse what I'm actually saying, none of it is actually material. And I would include visual updates of the mine. So people should follow my Twitter account. I give, generally speaking, once a week pictures of how the mine is progressing with our security camera. I remember last year there was a bunch of people that complains that I put out a tweet saying that we hit some visual mineralization in some core that we had right before I was actually going on a site visit with investors and analysts. And I'm like, you can't have a site visit with investors and analysts and show them core with mineralization without putting that out there in the public domain. So one of the reasons why I would do that, and we always err on the side of transparency in the sense that I want the information out there. Like I'm the executive of the company. I am biased. I'm going to be putting out information that's going to be for the benefit of Mako, not for the benefit of getting truth out there. Truth is for philosophy students. I'm there from a marketing perspective on as a CEO of Mako. But everything I'm doing is to try to put out transparency so that people can understand what's going on over at Mako and then make an investment case in their own right.
Okay, perfect. Let's sum it up. Let's sum Mako up for us. Next 3 months, what's coming out? I know you stopped the drilling, so more drills, I'm sure, pending. Give us a summary.
Right. So stopped the infill work. Right. So about a week and a half ago, we finished the infill work. We'll be putting out a press release, as I alluded to in the tweet, sometime this week about whatever data that we have. This is infill data, so take that into consideration. We had at our peak, we were running 6 rigs, 4 on the infill and then 2 on the greenfields work over at Las Conchitas. We're down to a single rig right now that's going to be drilling over at Las Conchitas. So results will be out over there. We'll have an updated resource estimate on San Albino in Q3 this year. We'll have a maiden resource on Las Conchitas sometime next calendar year with the hopes that we can double production to 1,000 tons a day by late 2022. We haven't done any work on some of the regional exploration, which I'm kind of very eager to do starting early next year. And then in terms of the milestones from the project, we're about 65% done getting built right now. The next 35%, it's kind of like a logistics nightmare trying to do this in the middle of COVID, but we're doing the best that we can. Most of the work that we need to do is to finish off our dry stack tailing storage facility. So over there, you'll see a lot of updates on how we're moving there. The mining until now has been focused on waste development because we actually needed a lot of the waste rock for our tailings area. There's been some delays on getting our lab up and running. Hopefully we'll get that up and running next month. And then once our lab is up and running, then we can kind of focus on areas of the mine with some of the high grade ore, although we have exposed some of the high grade ore in our deposit with our mining that initially commenced in February.
Okay, fantastic. Akiba, that was a great summary. We actually got a really good, interesting conversation out of this because I was trying to get a couple of pieces of information that haven't been offered elsewhere and that you can find. And I'm going to link to a couple other webinars where you flip through the pages. I think it's really interesting to see like what the whole project area looks like. But that's a different conversation, right? So really appreciate you coming on. Good luck building it, and I hope to speak to you again soon. So stay safe.
All right, great. All right,
guys. Everybody else, thanks for tuning in. Make sure you follow us on YouTube, Twitter. Make sure you subscribe, follow us, turn on the alerts. That way you get push notifications when we go live with another live chat like with Akiba today. And again, thanks for tuning in. Talk soon.